When the HOA president is pounding on your door at 7 a.m. holding a bag of your stolen alpaca feed like she just uncovered contraband, you realize you've stepped into a different kind of war zone. I stood there barefoot, staring at Karen, 40-something, sharp blazer already on, hair sprayed into a helmet that could deflect hail, and she was waving the bag like a flag of victory. This, she snapped, was cluttering the community mailbox area. Against regulations. I confiscated it. My brain stalled, caught between disbelief and amusement. Cluttering? It was delivered to my porch last night. Still sealed, bright red label with my name across it. She had marched right up my steps, grabbed my pet supplies, and now believed she had the authority of a customs officer. My alpacas, Morty and his younger companion Tilly, were bleating in the background as though they sensed betrayal. The neighborhood was still quiet, but a few blinds twitched, and I knew the gossip mill would be spinning by lunch. I didn't yell. That's never my style. Instead, I let her finish her triumphant lecture about bylaws, appearances, and how livestock feed encouraged undesirable animals. When she finally paused for air, I simply asked, "Do alpacas count as undesirable, or are you just jealous they spit less than you?" Her face tightened, her knuckles whitening around the bag. A neighbor's muffled laugh slipped through an open window. Karen flushed crimson and declared, "You'll be fined." She marched off like a general retreating in disgrace, leaving me holding nothing but a simmering certainty that this wasn't about feed. This was about control. Later that morning, I discovered she had emailed the entire HOA board, spinning a story about how she intercepted hazardous bulk goods before they caused an infestation. She attached a blurry photo of the bag in her car, as though she'd busted a smuggling ring. I stared at the email chain, the absurdity mixing with irritation, and realized the stakes weren't just a bag of pellets. If she painted me as a rule breaker, she could escalate. And Karen thrived on escalation. By afternoon, things grew stranger. The bag of feed vanished from her porch. She claimed in another email that she had disposed of the hazard responsibly. Yet, that evening, when I took Morty and Tilly for their walk down the lane, Karen reappeared with the same bag, except this time it was ripped open. She dumped half the contents on the road, dramatically pointing as if she had caught me in the act of littering. "See!" she shouted at a couple across the street. "This is what happens when livestock is allowed in a respectable neighborhood." Morty's ears flicked forward, and before I could even pull the lead, he trotted over, sniffed the spilled pellets, and then, because alpacas are masters of timing, let out a loud, wet spit directly onto Karen's pristine blouse. The couple across the street gasped, then laughed. Karen shrieked like she'd been assaulted by acid. I apologized calmly, offered her a towel, and pointed out that technically, she was the one scattering food on the street. That did not improve her mood. She stormed off, promising official consequences. My animals, of course, pranced proudly all the way home, tails flicking as if they had scored the opening point in a match neither of us had agreed to play. But the real twist came the next morning. Karen tried to march into my backyard with a clipboard, announcing she was conducting an inspection for unapproved structures. She didn't expect the gate to be latched. She rattled it furiously, shouting about bylaws. Morty and Tilly strolled up behind me like furry bodyguards, ears perked, heads tilting at her rising pitch. When she realized she was locked out, she attempted to climb the fence. That's when Tilly suddenly charged, an alpaca sprint, surprisingly fast, surprisingly determined. Karen shrieked and leapt back, catching her blazer sleeve on the fence, ripping it as she scrambled away. She fled down the street, clipboard abandoned, alpacas trotting after her like a fluffy cavalry. Neighbors came out to watch. Some filmed. Karen ran in heels, hair bouncing, while my alpacas gave chase, not menacingly, but with relentless curiosity. The sight was absurd, comical, and impossible to misinterpret. By the time she stumbled near the community mailbox, half the street was laughing. One neighbor called out, "Looks like the livestock passed inspection." Karen's face was streaked with fury, her sleeve dangling, her authority shredded along with her blazer. I gathered Morty and Tilly calmly, clipped their leads, and walked them home. No need to gloat. The images were already burned into every neighbor's mind, and probably a few phones. I knew Karen wouldn't forget this humiliation, and I also knew it wasn't over. People like her never retreated quietly. She'd escalate, regroup, and strike back in some new, creative way. And when she did, I'd be ready, one step ahead, because I had learned something crucial. Alpacas don't just eat pellet. They eat egos for breakfast. When the board email arrived the next morning, its subject line practically screamed at me. Urgent HOA matter, livestock crisis. I clicked it with the sort of half-smile one reserves for sitcom reruns, already predicting Karen's dramatic flair. Sure enough, she had written a 3-page manifesto accusing me of harboring dangerous animals, citing last night's attack as proof. According to her version, my alpacas had charged an officer of the HOA and attempted to maim her in broad daylight, which was fascinating since every video my neighbors posted on our street group chat showed the opposite. Morty and Tilly looked like overgrown stuffed toys bounding after a shrieking woman, hardly the menace she described. Still, her words dripped with urgency, and she demanded an emergency meeting to address my breach of community safety. My phone buzzed constantly as neighbors forwarded me screenshots, attaching laughing emojis and gifs of alpacas in running shoes. A few even asked if Morty and Tilly were available for birthday parties. Yet underneath the humor, I sensed the real danger. Karen had planted her flag. If the board indulged her narrative, she could push for fines, restrictions, even removal of my animals. For her, this wasn't about alpacas. It was about power, reputation, and her need to reassert dominance after being publicly humiliated. People like Karen thrived on control, and when it slipped, they doubled down. That evening, the emergency meeting took place in the HOA clubhouse. The place smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee, as if it were trying and failing to cover decades of grudges. Karen sat at the head of the table, blazer freshly stitched, her sleeve patched with such care it looked like she had personally instructed a tailor while dictating her grievances. She held a thick binder of bylaws, tabs bristling like feathers, and greeted me with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Around the table sat the other board members. Harold, who never looked up from his crossword, Denise, who balanced sympathy with exhaustion, and Peter, who treated every rule like a chess move. A handful of neighbors filled the back rows, most curious to see what drama would unfold. Karen opened with a speech so theatrical it could have used a spotlight. She painted herself as a victim, bravely confronting my supposed illegal feed stockpile, only to be assaulted by animals known for aggressive spitting and charging. She gestured with her patched sleeve as evidence, as though alpacas had specifically targeted her couture. Her voice rose and cracked in just the right places, a performance sharpened from years of PDA meetings and neighborhood squabbles. Then she dropped her demand. The board must force me to remove Morty and Tilly from the community, or at the very least confine them to a structure invisible to public view. I waited for the dramatic pause, then stood, keeping my tone calm, steady, almost amused. I presented my veterinary permits, zoning allowances, and HOA-approved paperwork for livestock that had been filed years before she even moved into the neighborhood. I projected a video from my phone onto the wall, the very clip that half the street had already watched online, showing Karen scattering feed on the road and then fleeing in panic while 2 fluffy alpacas trotted after her, looking like escapees from a petting zoo. The room erupted in laughter. Even Harold looked up from his crossword long enough to chuckle. Karen's face burned red, but she pushed forward, insisting videos could be doctored and neighbors were biased. That was the first twist. Karen didn't retreat. Instead, she shifted tactics. She accused me of being reckless with deliveries and allowing bulk supplies to clutter public spaces. She waved around a printout of a supposed regulation about aesthetic uniformity, arguing that bags of feed didn't match the neighborhood's visual standard. It was absurd, but I could see some board members leaning forward. This was her genius. If one angle failed, she pivoted to another. She didn't need the truth. She just needed enough noise to confuse the issue. I countered with my own quiet weapon, patience. I explained how alpacas were low-impact animals, cleaner than dogs, quieter than lawnmowers, and oddly therapeutic. I even had letters from neighbors who enjoyed seeing Morty and Tilly on their walks, who said the animals brightened their kids' mornings at the bus stop. I pointed out that HOA bylaws explicitly allowed non-disruptive livestock under proper care, a clause Karen had conveniently ignored. And then, with deliberate calm, I suggested a compromise. If the board felt visibility was an issue, I'd plant a row of shrubs near my fence line to soften the view. That offer wasn't about appeasement. It was about showing the board I was reasonable, measured, the opposite of the caricature Karen painted. The board deliberated briefly. Denise spoke first, noting that community spirit mattered more than petty dispute. Peter tried to parse legal language, but ultimately conceded the bylaws favored me. Harold, perhaps out of boredom, motioned to close the matter entirely. The board voted 3-1 in my favor. Karen lost. On paper. But the way she tightened her jaw, the way her hand gripped the binder like it was a weapon, she wasn't finished. She was already planning her next move. And indeed, her counterstrike arrived within days. Packages began disappearing from porches, not just mine. Pet supplies, groceries, even a neighbor's Amazon order of cat litter vanished. Rumors spread fast, and somehow Karen always seemed to be the one to discover the empty boxes tossed near the dumpsters, pointing fingers at the problematic presence of livestock feed attracting thieves. It was subtle, devious, and infuriatingly effective. People began muttering about whether my deliveries had drawn trouble to the neighborhood. I knew the truth. Karen was orchestrating the thefts to frame me, but proving it was another matter. So I set a trap. The next time my feed order arrived, I left the bag on my porch in plain sight. Inside, tucked between layers of alpaca pellets, I placed a small GPS tracker no bigger than a coin. My friend Jake, who lived down the block, helped me set up a motion-activated camera. Then I waited. Sure enough, that night the bag vanished. The tracker pinged, moving steadily down the street, straight to Karen's garage. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I waited until the weekend, when neighbors were out tending lawns, washing cars, chatting by the mailboxes. That's when I strolled casually to Karen's driveway with Morty and Tilly in tow. I knocked on her garage door until she opened it, flustered, clearly not expecting an audience. And there, stacked neatly behind her SUV, were half a dozen stolen packages, including my feed. I didn't raise my voice. I simply gestured at the stash and said loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, "Funny place for lost deliveries to end up." Phones came out. Cameras clicked. Karen sputtered excuses about holding them for safekeeping, but no one was buying it. Morty, as if on cue, stepped forward and let out another magnificent spit, this time splattering across the bumper of her shiny Lexus. The neighbors roared with laughter. By Monday morning the neighborhood felt like a stage set waiting for its next act. People whispered by their mailboxes, exchanged amused glances when I walked Morty and Tilly, and half expected the alpacas to pull some new stunt. Even my wife, who usually avoided HOA gossip, leaned over breakfast and asked if I planned to install a popcorn machine for the inevitable sequel. I shrugged, but inside I knew the story was tilting toward something more dangerous. Karen wasn't just embarrassed, she was cornered. And cornered people with a taste for control don't simply retreat, they reinvent the battlefield. The first sign came in the form of a glossy flyer shoved into every mailbox. The title, bold enough to mimic an official government notice, read, "Neighborhood Safety Alert, Livestock Threat." Beneath it was a dramatic paragraph about the dangers of alpacas, spitting diseases, trampling risks, property damage, even psychological intimidation of children. Karen had copied grainy photos from Google of snarling llamas, passing them off as documented cases. She warned that unless decisive action was taken, our community would be overrun by unregulated creatures. The flyer bore the HOA logo, though everyone knew Karen had simply slapped it on herself. At first, I laughed. Then I watched a few neighbors frown as they read, hesitating before waving at me. Rumor has weight, and Karen understood that. I realized I had to counter not with louder words, but with undeniable proof that reality was funnier than her fiction. So that afternoon, I invited half the neighborhood over for an impromptu alpaca meet and greet. Kids ran in my yard feeding Morty and Tilly carrots, parents snapped selfies, and laughter rippled as the alpacas nuzzled and pranced like oversized puppies. I casually mentioned that alpacas were so low maintenance they didn't even need shoes walked off the lawn. No poop piles, no barking at 2 a.m. videos of children giggling while Morty sniffed their hair spread across the neighborhood Facebook page faster than Karen's flyer could circulate. The contrast was brutal. Her shrill warnings versus first-hand joy. Karen, of course, showed up halfway through, clutching a clipboard and muttering about permit. She tried to scold a group of teenagers for provoking dangerous livestock, when all they were doing was feeding pellets. Morty leaned in, sniffed her clipboard, and tugged it right out of her hands with his teeth. The crowd burst into cheers as he pranced in circles with her paperwork flapping like a victory flag. I retrieved it before he chewed too far, but the damage was done. Karen stormed off, her voice drowned out by laughter. Yet even as she disappeared, I knew she was calculating her next move. That evening, the real escalation arrived. A certified letter slid under my door, stamped with legal insignias. Karen had filed an official complaint, not only with the HOA but with the County Animal Control Office, accusing me of running an unlicensed livestock operation. The complaint included photos. My backyard, my feed bags, my alpacas grazing, taken from angles only possible if someone had been trespassing onto my property. The realization chilled me. This wasn't petty flyers or dramatic meetings anymore. She had crossed into surveillance, into violating boundaries. I called the county office the next day, bracing for bureaucracy. To my relief, the inspector assigned to the complaint was pragmatic. He arrived in a dusty pickup, clipboard in hand, and within minutes was petting Morty's neck and chuckling about how tame they were. He confirmed my paperwork was in order, my fencing was compliant, and my animals were healthier than most suburban dogs. He left shaking his head, muttering about wasted taxpayer time. But his final comment stuck. She'll be madder now that she didn't get her way. Keep your eyes open. Sure enough, Karen pivoted again. A week later, several neighbors discovered letters taped to their doors warning them about health hazards from alpacas contaminating water runoff. She claimed their wool carried allergens that could travel through the air ducts of nearby houses. One neighbor actually called me, worried their toddler might develop asthma. I had to calmly explain alpaca fiber is hypoallergenic, less irritating than wool sweaters, and that Karen's letters were pure invention. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted, and I realized Karen's real weapon wasn't rules or even theft. It was fear. That's when I decided to flip the board entirely. Instead of just defending, I'd expose her tactic. Jake, my tech-savvy friend down the street, helped me set up discreet motion cameras at key spots on my property. Within 3 nights, we caught footage of Karen sneaking along my fence line with a phone in hand, snapping pictures, sometimes even reaching over to scatter small piles of feed, as if staging evidence. One clip showed her tiptoeing in heels at midnight, a scene so absurd it looked like a failed comedy sketch. I didn't release the footage immediately. Timing mattered. Instead, I let Karen dig deeper. She called for another HOA meeting, this time demanding a vote to revoke my right to keep alpacas altogether. She strutted into the clubhouse armed with printouts of her fake flyers, photos of staged feed piles, and a long speech about protecting children. By then, she had clearly convinced herself this was her moment of triumph. She paced in front of the crowd, voice rising, practically glowing with self-righteous fire. That's when I calmly pulled out a flash drive, handed it to Peter, and suggested he play it on the projector. The room fell silent as the footage rolled. Karen skulking along my fence in the dark, scattering pellets, snapping photos, tripping once and barely catching herself against the post. Gasps, laughter, then outright disbelief spread through the audience. By the time the clip ended, Karen's face was pale, her jaw locked. Someone muttered, "She's framing him," and the phrase rippled across the room. Karen tried to salvage dignity, insisting she was documenting violations. But the footage betrayed her. Her credibility evaporated in minutes. Neighbors who had wavered before now saw her for what she was, a self-appointed sheriff manufacturing crimes to justify her crusade. The board adjourned the meeting without even entertaining her vote. And as the crowd spilled outside, I noticed people patting Morty and Tilly like local celebrities. Kids begged their parents for alpaca playdate. Karen stood alone on the clubhouse steps, binder clutched against her chest, her authority shredded yet again. But here's the thing about people like Karen: losing doesn't end the fight. It mutates it. Later that night, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, I saw her pacing her driveway, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp and animated. She wasn't done. She was calling in reinforcements, higher authorities, anyone who might listen. She had lost ground in the neighborhood, but her need to control, to punish, would only drive her to escalate beyond HOA politics. And though I felt a surge of victory, I also felt a flicker of unease. Because if she couldn't win with bylaws or staged photos, she'd find a bigger stage, and I had a sinking suspicion that stage was coming soon. The storm hit without rain or thunder. It came in the form of a thick white envelope stamped with the seal of the county health department. I found it wedged in my mailbox early one morning, heavy with paperwork that crackled when I opened it. Inside was a formal notice of investigation. Possible public health hazard associated with exotic livestock. My jaw clenched as I skimmed the language. Anonymous complaints had triggered an inquiry into whether my alpacas posed risks of spreading parasites, contaminating soil, and destabilizing the residential balance of the neighborhood. The letter promised an on-site inspection within 72 hours. The allegations weren't just overblown, they were deliberately cruel, calculated to sound terrifying to anyone who didn't know alpacas from alligators. And of course, the phrase "anonymous complaint" carried the faint perfume of hairspray and control issues. By lunchtime, my phone buzzed with texts from neighbors who had also received copies of the notice. Some were outraged on my behalf, others cautious, their messages laced with concern. "Hey, just checking, do alpacas actually carry worms? Or, should my kids stop feeding them carrots until this clears up?" The damage was already seeping through the cracks. Karen had bypassed the HOA entirely, leapfrogging into county bureaucracy. And unlike neighborhood politics, county inspectors weren't swayed by laughter or alpaca selfies. They lived and died by paperwork. That night I sat on the porch with Morty and Tilly lounging at my feet, their soft humming a strange comfort. My wife joined me, sipping tea, her expression unreadable. "She's going bigger," she said finally. "This isn't about alpacas anymore. She wants to break you. She wants to break us." I knew she was right. The theft, the flyers, the midnight trespassing, those were warm-up. Now Karen had escalated to the level of government muscle. And if the county inspectors bought even a sliver of her narrative, they could force me to rehome Morty and Tilly, maybe even fine me into submission. But here's the thing about people who overreach. They leave fingerprints. The next morning, Jake came over with a grin plastered on his face and a USB drive in hand. "You're going to love this," he said, firing up his laptop. He dug into the metadata of the county complaint, a public record that listed timestamps and digital submission details. Buried in the technical data was the source email that filed the form, masked behind a generic Gmail, but clumsy enough to still include recovery info tied to a phone number. And that number? It matched the contact line Karen herself had published on HOA newsletters for years. It was proof, not just suspicion, not circumstantial whispers, but ironclad evidence that Karen had forged the health scare. The problem was timing. If I blasted this out before the inspection, Karen would simply pivot to claiming she was concerned for the children, or misunderstood. The inspectors might feel pressured into finding something, anything, just to justify their involvement. But if I waited until after the inspection, and they cleared me, then exposed Karen as the false complainant, it would destroy whatever credibility she had left. So I played the long game. I spent the next 2 days prepping the yard like it was a showroom. Fresh water troughs, spotless fencing, health certificates pinned in a neat binder. Morty and Tilly got brushed until their coats gleamed. By the time the inspectors arrived, a pair of weary-looking officials in khakis and polos, the place looked less like a farm and more like a suburban magazine spread. The alpacas, as if sensing the importance, behaved like saints, nuzzling the inspectors' hands and humming gently as they flipped through paperwork. One inspector even laughed and snapped a selfie with Morty, joking that his niece loved alpacas. Karen, of course, appeared halfway through, pretending it was a coincidence. She hovered at the fence line in oversized sunglasses, offering pointed coughs and muttered reminders about parasites and property values. The inspectors barely acknowledged her. After a thorough walkthrough, they signed off the report. No violations, no hazards, no further action required. They even noted in their comments that the animals were well cared for, clean, and beneficial to community morale. I couldn't have scripted it better myself. That night, I released the evidence. I emailed the neighborhood mailing list, attaching both the inspector's glowing report and Jake's metadata discovery tying the false complaint to Karen. My message was short, surgical. For those concerned about recent rumors, the county has officially cleared Morty and Tilly. For transparency, I'm also sharing proof of where the complaint originated. That was all. No insults, no gloating, just facts and receipts. The reaction was immediate. My phone lit up with laughing emojis, outraged replies, and screenshots of neighbors roasting Karen in the group chat. Someone even photoshopped her face onto a wanted poster for false complaints and crimes against alpacas. Within an hour, half the neighborhood had turned on her. The other half, even those who had once tolerated her, fell silent, unwilling to defend someone caught red-handed. By morning, the flyer that appeared on every mailbox wasn't hers. It was a meme of Morty wearing sunglasses with the caption, "Health hazard? Only to Karen's." I thought that might end it. I thought perhaps she would retreat, lick her wounds, maybe even move. But Karen wasn't built that way. Losing in front of the HOA, losing in front of the county, losing in front of the entire neighborhood, it didn't teach her humility. It hardened her. 2 days later, she parked her Lexus in front of my driveway, blocking me in, claiming she had every right because the street is public property. When I asked her to move, she filmed me on her phone, narrating loudly about being harassed by aggressive livestock owners. Neighbors rolled their eyes, but the message was clear. If she couldn't win through rules, she'd win through harassment. Things spiraled further when she started baiting Morty and Tilly directly. She'd stand by the fence with a spray bottle of water, misting them and shrieking if they moved toward her. Once, she even brought a portable air horn, blasting it until Morty bolted. I caught it on video, of course, but by then it was obvious. This wasn't just an HOA squabble anymore. It was psychological warfare. And it wasn't just aimed at me. My wife came home one evening to find a note taped to our door reading, "This neighborhood deserves better." I wanted to fight back, to hit her with restraining orders and lawsuits, but I forced myself to pause. People like Karen crave immediate conflict because it validates their sense of importance. The real revenge wasn't in screaming matches. It was in patience, strategy, and timing. And sure enough, the opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. It came in the form of the annual HOA barbecue. Every summer, the community gathered on the cul-de-sac, dragging out grills, picnic tables, and coolers. Karen had always run the event, priding herself on being the organizer, the hostess, the center of attention. This year, after the complaint fiasco, there was quiet debate about whether she should still lead it. But Karen, stubborn as ever, insisted. She showed up with her clipboard, barking orders, bossing neighbors, trying to reassert dominance. It began with silence, which in a neighborhood like ours was never a good sign. After the barbecue humiliation, Karen seemed to vanish. No flyers, no emails, no midnight prowling caught on cameras. Days stretched into a week, then 2. Morty and Tilly grazed in peace, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip, and I almost convinced myself she had finally given up. But I should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to retreat, she was the type to regroup. And when she finally resurfaced, she did it with the kind of spectacle only she could engineer. It started on a Saturday morning. I woke to the low rumble of machinery outside my window. At first I thought it was routine landscaping, but when I stepped onto the porch, I froze. Karen stood in the street with a hired crew, 3 men in neon vests unloading orange construction cones and metal fencing. Her Lexus was parked proudly like a command center, trunk open, clipboard in hand. She was directing the men to block off the cul-de-sac, announcing loudly that she had official clearance to begin livestock containment operations. Neighbors spilled onto porches in bathrobes and slippers, whispering in disbelief. I walked down the driveway, Morty and Tilly watching curiously from behind the fence, their ears twitching. "Karen," I said, my voice steady, "what exactly are you doing?" She didn't even look at me. Instead, she raised her voice so the entire street could hear. "As acting head of neighborhood safety, I am ordering the construction of a temporary holding pen to prevent these dangerous animals from further endangering our children. The county will thank me later." The crew hesitated, clearly uncertain whether they were digging post holes for an HOA or staging a hostage situation. I calmly asked to see her permit. She waved her clipboard like it was the Magna Carta. "This is authorization from the board," she declared. Except the papers she flipped through weren't permits, they were printouts of bylaws with random sections highlighted in yellow. Peter, one of the board members, appeared from his driveway and shouted, "Karen, the board never approved this." The crowd murmured, cell phones rising to record. Karen's jaw twitched, but she barked at the crew to continue. That was the moment Morty intervened. Drawn by the noise, he leaned against the fence, his long neck stretching curiously toward the commotion. The fence wobbled, and Karen shrieked, pointing dramatically. "See! They're breaking loose already!" She gestured frantically, and in her rush, she grabbed a cone from the worker's hand, running toward the fence like she could single-handedly block an alpaca with road plastic. Morty tilted his head, then, perhaps sensing the absurdity, let out a magnificent, wet spit that caught her square across the sunglasses. Gasps and laughter erupted. Karen stumbled back, shrieking, smearing spit across her face in a frantic attempt to recover dignity. The workers froze, unsure whether to keep building or flee. One muttered something about not being paid enough for this. Then Tilly, emboldened by Morty's display, gave a joyful bleat and pranced along the fence line, setting off a chain reaction. The neighborhood kids, who had been watching wide-eyed, erupted in cheers, chanting, "Morty! Tilly! Morty! Tilly!" Phones captured every second. Karen's plan, whatever it had been, crumbled before her eyes. But the spectacle didn't end there. As she screamed about violations and trespassing, a sheriff's cruiser rolled into the cul-de-sac. Someone had clearly called in the commotion. The deputy stepped out, surveyed the cones, the half-built pen, the red-faced woman dripping alpaca spit, and sighed the kind of sigh only law enforcement in suburbia can muster. "Ma'am," he said, "do you have permits for this?" Karen launched into a tirade about bylaws, danger, parasites, community safety. The deputy let her talk, then turned to me. "Do you have your livestock paperwork?" I handed him the neatly organized binder, complete with the county's clean inspection report. He flipped through, nodded, and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to dismantle this immediately. You're trespassing on county right-of-way." The deputy might as well have dropped a gavel. The workers packed up within minutes, loading cones back into the truck. Karen screamed about being silenced, about conspiracies, about corruption. The deputy warned her once more, then left, shaking his head. Karen stood in the street alone, chest heaving, her power evaporated in front of every neighbor. She tried to rally, shouting about filing appeals, but the crowd had already dispersed, still laughing, still recording. That night, I sat on the porch again, Morty and Tilly grazing quietly in the yard. The adrenaline of the day gave way to something quieter, heavier. For months, Karen had thrown everything at us: petty theft, false complaints, harassment, sabotage. She had been relentless. But now, after today's fiasco, she looked more like a desperate performer than a threat. I realized something important. People like her can't survive without an audience. And today her audience had turned. The final twist came not from me, but from the board itself. A week later, the HOA held a special meeting. This time, Karen wasn't at the head of the table. She sat in the back, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. Denise, tired but resolute, read the motion aloud. Due to repeated misuse of authority, harassment of residents, falsification of complaints, and reckless endangerment of community peace, the board moves to remove Karen from her position as HOA president effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. The room erupted in quiet applause. Karen shot to her feet, threatening lawsuits, promising to take this to the highest court, but no one listened. Her reign was over. Walking home that night, I passed her house. The blinds were shut tight, her Lexus absent from the driveway. For the first time in months, the street felt calm. Neighbors lingered outside, talking not about drama but about upcoming block parties, about kids starting school, about normal life. Morty and Tilly had become unofficial mascots of the cul-de-sac, their photos still circulating online with captions like "Neighborhood Watch," "Alpaca Division." I thought about everything we'd endured: the stolen feed, the false complaints, the midnight trespasses, the spectacle of cones and fences. It had been exhausting, absurd, sometimes even frightening. But it had also revealed something powerful. Karen believed control came from rules, from intimidation, from fear. She never understood that real control, the kind that lasts, comes from trust, humor, and quiet resilience. She had tried to tear down the community to build her own pedestal, and in the end, the community stood taller without her. As I locked the gate that night, Morty leaned his head against my shoulder, humming softly. Tilly pranced in circles behind him, playful as ever. I scratched Morty's neck, feeling the tension finally drain. The war was over. Karen might still lurk, still send angry emails, still stew in her house with her binder of bylaws, but she no longer had power here. She had lost the neighborhood. And in her place, 2 alpacas had claimed the spotlight, not through aggression or politics, but simply by being themselves.